Good evening. Welcome, everyone. I'm Tony Martinez, Programs Coordinator at the Menil Collection. Thank you all for joining us for our program this evening, a lecture with the Menil's Curator of Collections, Paul R. Davis, titled Dynamic Form and Ambiguity, a Mabuh Headdress at the Menil. Tonight's program has been organized in conjunction with the Menil's exhibition, Art of the Cameroon Grassfields, a Living Heritage in Houston, curated by Paul Davis and on view through July 9th. The exhibition celebrates the enduring artistic traditions from Cameroon and its global diaspora. As always, the Menil's public programs are free and open to everyone. We have more public programs coming up this spring, and I encourage you to visit our website or pick up a copy of our Spring Public Programs Guide at the back desk to learn more. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. If you haven't not already done so, please silence your cell phones. Paul's lecture will last about 40 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor for a few audience questions. Please hold your questions until then so that we can come around to you with a microphone. This program is being recorded and will be available for on-demand viewing on the Menil's YouTube page in the upcoming weeks. And now a few brief words of introduction to our speaker. Dr. Paul R. Davis, Curator of Collections at the Menil Collection, and oversees the museum's holdings of art from Africa, Pacific Islands, and the Americas in the ancient world and pre-1900 Europe. His research focuses on the visual arts and cultures of French-speaking West Africa between the 18th and 21st centuries. His recent exhibition projects include Art of the Cameroon Grassfields, a Living Heritage in Houston, 2023, Enchanted Visual Histories of the Central Andes, 2021, Mapuh, Your Map's Not Needed, 2019, and Recollecting Dogon, 2017. At this time, please join me in welcoming Paul Davis.
Good evening. Hello? Good. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining me this evening for tonight's talk. Thank you to Tony for the really nice introduction. That's the first time I think I've been introduced at the Menil Collection. I'm usually doing the introducing, so thank you very much. And I'm really excited to talk tonight about dynamic form and ambiguity. But first, I'd just like to highlight Dr. Victoria Massey's talk on April 27th, which is also in conjunction with the exhibition. And her talk is going to draw on her ethnographic fieldwork in Cameroon and reflects on how African Americans and Cameroonians are connecting through genetic ancestry tests as part of a poetic approach to kinship, solidarity, and personhood. So again, that's on April 27th, and I hope to see some of you back here for that. Right. So, okay, that talks focusing on the peoples and places of the vast continent of Africa typically and tediously begin with a map as a common stereotype to which I am conforming this evening. The region known as the Grassfields in Cameroon is incredibly diverse. It's a verdant rural mountainscape interrupted by densely populated urban commercial centers and more than 150 kingdoms each speaking a different language. This map helpfully simplifies some of the region's incredible diversity by distinguishing three major stylistic or cultural areas: the Northwest Province, Bamileke region, and Bamum region, as well as major artistic centers, the city of Bamenda, and colonial capital Fumban. It will be reappearing feature in tonight's talk as we discuss the history of the Mabuh mask on view in the Menil's collection, or in the Menil's exhibition, Art of the Cameroon Grassfields, a Living Heritage in Houston. So, the exhibition highlights the historical art from the Grassfields and local Houston collections. And I'm grateful to the lenders and also to the exhibition sponsors who donated to make this exhibition possible. But the exhibition also explores how peoples and cultures and visual arts from the Grassfield region continue to change and move in the world, and hence the contemporary installation by Hervé Yumbi in the Menil's Garden Gallery. The Mabuh headdress is associated with a prominent all-male regulatory society called kwifon, or Nuerong, whose all-male members are responsible for preserving social and political harmony in the community. Kwifon may appear at funerals, enthronement of new kings, and other important events in which the society can intervene. One of the several headdresses included in the Menil's exhibition, the Mabuh, is an exceptionally carved sculptural form. I think you can see that if you look at the ways in which the split nose ridge is done, the exaggeration of the cheeks, which are ballooned, the expressive and all the other expressive features, including the eye sockets. The Mabuh headdress is a really distinct example. The one at the Menil Collection is a really distinct example, as is noted by the collector, Pierre Arte, who traveled in Cameroon during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and is one of the major contributors to the art historical literature. He thought very highly of the Menil's example and published it in his Art Ancien Cameroun, which was published in 1986. But to highlight just some of the other parts of the headdress that you may not often see, the back side of the headdress sort of continues this idea of the incredible carving that is part of the Mabuh. And you see motifs of frogs and spiders that reference local mythologies, proverbs, and divination practices that make up its entirety of its hairstyle. And so there you see an example of the frog motif. And frogs also have a reference to, in many Grassfields communities, to fertility that is not just associated with human fertility, but also with agricultural fertility. And to the left and right of the frog, you see these rows that may correspond to actually agricultural rows in planting season. So this visual analysis and art historical research on the Mabuh at the Menil Collection points to some of the discrepancies in the purchase story, what I like to call the purchase story, of its origins in the Cameroon Grassfields. And the purchase story is something that comes from the dealer that says what it is and why it's great. And so we'll talk a little bit about that tonight. And as Dominique Malaquet, the late Dominique Malaquet, emphasizes in her entry on the headdress in African art from the Menil Collection, the movement of objects in the Grassfields and interregional indigenous art histories of Cameroon underscore, quote, the fallacy of insisting on categorizing works of African art by matching styles to specific localities and ethnic groups, end quote. The ambiguity resulting from this fallacy and years of building on it is further complicated by the histories of European colonialism and the growth of international market for African art objects. These 20th century interventions into the region, which have also contributed to inventing and obfuscating art histories of objects. And that's sort of what I wanted to get to tonight with tonight's talk. However, I want to say that, even though that sounds really down and negative, I want to say that all is not lost and that there is still much to be learned. And the case of the Mabuh headdress is very illustrative of this. So before diving back into sort of the Mabuh and its cultural, social cultural significance as part of kwifon, I wanted to spend a little bit of time dealing with the history of how it got to the Menil. So the de Menils purchased the headdress in 1971 in advance of the exhibition and publication project African Art as Philosophy. This was an exhibition that was originally conceived by Douglas Fraser at Columbia University. African Art as Philosophy was part of the programming for the third Triennial Symposium of African Art in 1974, which was held in New York. And you can see on the right, there's an image of Douglas Fraser whose name will come up later as well, standing with one of the Menil's objects. And on the left is the installation at Rice University of the Menil's collection for African art as philosophy. The exhibition included the newly acquired Mabuh headdress, as well as several other headdresses from the Grassfields. And you can see, it's very small, but there it is. And some of the other headdresses that are in the exhibition are also to the left of that. This was probably the first real exhibition that the headdress was in, and it's important as a sort of moment in the object's biography. But I want to take another step back to think about where this actually came from. Who did the Menils acquire it from? And that would be the venerable J.J. Kledgeman, or John J. Kledgeman. John and Dominique de Menil purchased it from him in 1971. Kledgeman was a Polish-American immigrant art dealer based in New York. He opened his first gallery in 1957 on West 56th Street, and which interestingly enough was just a few blocks away from the Park Bernay or Sotheby's auction house, as well as Nelson Rockefeller's brand new, or at the time of the opening of his gallery, was the brand new Museum of Primitive Art, at which John de Menil would become a member of the board. And then in 1962, Kledgeman moved his gallery to Madison Avenue, just down the street from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So a very cleverly, strategically placed gallery when you're dealing with African art. And the de Menils were repeated patrons of Kledgeman's. Kledgeman was a dear friend and a very respected advisor for the de Menils, and it shows in the number of objects that they purchased from him. What was interesting is that he was not known at the time as necessarily an African or a dealer in African art or Pacific Island art. He was primarily a dealer in ancient art. And so we actually have at the Menil Collection a number of works from in the ancient art collection that are from him as well. And so thinking about Kledgeman and thinking about the stories that dealers tell and tend to exaggerate, I wanted to bring in a parallel case about another headdress that is also in the exhibition. This headdress is one that represents the wife of a fawn, and it's from the Babanki or Babanki-Tungao region. And it's a really wonderful example that was restored or repaired for this exhibition. Now, this is a parallel example because this too comes from John Kledgeman's gallery a little bit earlier, so it's 1970, as you can see by the provenance listed. Now, Kledgeman lists this region as the location of or the origin of this headdress. But as part of the research for the exhibition and part of the research on the objects in the exhibition, I discovered this photo. In this photo is pictured the headdress. But this photo was taken reportedly by Douglas Fraser, again, who curated African arts philosophy, in the maybe late 1960s, maybe in the early 1970s. But this photograph was taken, according to Douglas Fraser, at Babanki-Tungao. So that begs to that changes the equation a little bit when you're thinking about where Kledgeman's has associated the headdress. And he notes here that it is from Babanki-Tungao, although it's spelled differently. It's a kwifon headdress of the one of the four that you see here, and it has wood glass beads. And the only reason I was able to identify this as the headdress was because of the losses that it had sustained over time as part of its use in ceremonies. And the photograph is really crucial because these masks are being laid out for display in order to be sold. That is typical of these photographs from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s of masks that are being sold because they're no longer in use or represent figures that are no longer existing, or they have so much loss that they're no longer valid or usable. And in further research, we were able to identify, or I was able to identify, another headdress that had sold recently at a Christie's auction in Amsterdam in 2002. So of the 4 headdresses, we now know 2 of them are in current collections, one of them here at the Menil Collection. And so this is a parallel case in this idea of a purchase history, right? This idea of what dealers will tell a patron in order to accentuate an object's value or accentuate the story behind the object. And so what we have here are 2 different stories. One being that Kledgeman associates it with the cultures in the West and the Southwest, where Fraser has identified it actually being from the Babanki-Tungo region in the Northwest province. So this is one complication that we have to deal with in terms of deciphering these histories, revealing the layers of these histories of visual art from the African continent. The other, as I mentioned before, is this long history of colonial intervention. And in Cameroon, that starts very early. In the 1920s, in Fumban, the French government, now in control of Cameroon, part of Cameroon, established the artisanal school and mercantile center. And you could literally go there and buy traditional objects made in a traditional style as early as the 1920s. And these artisanal centers featured in publications, tourist magazines, and so forth. And you can see on the right that a stool, a tabouret sculpté, would cost you about 150 to 800 francs. So we have visual evidence of these things being made and being made for colonial consumption during the colonial period. And here's another fascinating example of the Fumban atelier. And in these photographs, one of the key figures is Mose Yeyep. And Mose was an important figure in that he was in direct contravention with the royal histories of commissioning work for the royal courts. And so he presented a real problem for the Fon in their longer history of commissioning visual culture for the courtly processions. But the interventions of colonialism were incredibly significant. By establishing museums in Yaoundé and Fumban, this is the Musée du Fumban in 1930, and then also with agricultural and artisanal fairs that happened in Yaoundé and Fumban and Bamenda. These were important moments in Cameroon where local artisanal specialists, sculptors, leather workers, beaters would put together objects for sale and for display at these colonial fairs in the colonies. The question is, and what's really fascinating, is that this just didn't happen in the colonies. This is not Cameroon. This is Paris in 1931. This was the Exposition Coloniale. This was the pavilion for the Exposition Coloniale Internationale in 1931. And you can see how extravagant and how detailed these were. And this was just one pavilion. There was another pavilion that focused on the Soudan Français, which is West Africa. And I brought in, just for fun, a few images that are sort of records of these. And on the left, you can see a painting by Francis Smith, who was an English painter working in France at the time, and his sort of rough impressionistic painting of the main pavilion's building, which was modeled after large Cameroonian palace homes of the Fawn, but was designed by a French architect. And then on the right, you see the same building, but in a photograph featuring Paul Guimard and potentially his cousin André Guimard, the well-known author Paul Guimard. And then, but this is not the end of it in 1931. One thing I'd like to point out before moving on is that this is a moment in which the de Menils were married in Paris. They were married 6 days just after the opening of the Exposition Coloniale Internationale. And we know that they attended the events there. And so you have to imagine that these sort of images and this sort of experience really impressed upon their future collecting of African art in the United States and in Houston in particular. A few more images of a later fair that I think are also significant, that also demonstrate the continued importance of the colonial fairs in Paris. And this one was the Exposition Internationale des Arts et Techniques in Paris in 1937. Again, this was sort of a display of France's colonial authority and power over much of West and Central Africa, but also into what was then called Indochine. And what's different about this one is this was modeled after a different region of Cameroon. This is from the Adamawa region in the far northwest, verging the border with Nigeria. And you see the exterior, and you also see the interior, and then you also see items that were made for sale and for display on view. And you see traditional sculptures, you see modern paintings done by French artists who had traveled to the colonies on scholarship by the French government. You see really interesting variations of large sculptural fountains that sort of are both African and French inspired. And it's an incredible moment of fusion, which is something that the artist Frankem King Noah talks about in his exhibition that happened at TSU and his work. And then finally, just to bring it to a more contemporary moment, this tradition of making things for sale and circulating objects through West and Central Africa and into Europe continues well into the 20th century. And this photograph by Hans-Joachim Kolas is an excellent example of that, with these masks and headdresses and stools that are made for sale and made to circulate. And I think that you'll see in this photograph a few examples that are really important, such as, let's see if I can get this. The Tsesa headdress here and here. And this example is incredibly fascinating because it has these additional brass buttons that have been added to it, which is not something that you would find on a Tsesa headdress traditionally. That is an importation most likely from West Africa, where you have brass tacks and beads that are added to sculptures to embellish them and make them stand out and shine and shimmer when they're danced. So going back to the headdresses that are in the exhibition, you have two parallel cases of works that were acquired from John Kledgman with stories that may not be totally accurate. And in the case of the Mabuh headdress, this is incredibly fascinating. But before I get too far down that road and show you more maps, I wanted to talk quickly about the local and indigenous ways in which this headdress was used in order to address some questions that may be about how it's being displayed now. So the Mabuh headdress is, again, part of the kwifon or Noirang society, which is a predominant society in the northwest of province of Cameroon. And the traditional dress that you would find the Mabuh with, the headdress with, would be this frock or tunic that extends all the way down to the feet and is covered with bird feathers, most likely turkey or large vulture feathers that are black, or sometimes chicken feathers. that are black. And then the headdress, as you can see, is not worn over the face. It's why we call it a headdress, is because it's worn on top of the head. And the face is covered by these woven textiles, sometimes with additional porcupine quills to kind of add or accentuate the danger or ferocity of the figure. And I think that's this idea of danger and ferocity really speaks to the dynamic form of the headdress in many ways. So looking at the headdress, it does not look terribly dangerous. It's a caricature. It looks almost inviting and fun, with the puffy cheeks, the sort of toothy grin, and the general expression of the headdress. But as you'll see as we move forward in the presentation, this is an alluring and maybe even deceptive approach of aesthetics here. Because in fact, Mabuh performances are can be incredibly dangerous. And when one encounters the headdress, it's not necessarily always a pleasant thing. Mabuh are considered to be runners for kwifon. They announce the more dangerous masks in the procession. So when they're presiding over funerals and when they're presiding over enthronements or any other important ceremony, they lead the way through the palace and through the ceremonial grounds and into the audience, and they can do a variety of things, not all of which are very nice. They often throw their spears and batons at people. They charge at them. And if you are not paying attention, you can be injured. And there is a really sophisticated ways in which the audience interacts with the Mabuh headdresses. And so, over the course of the exhibition, I've been in conversation with Louis Shifu, who is a video editor who lives in the Northwest and is sent film from the different performances that have happened over the last 2 years. And he posts these on YouTube. And so in conversation with Shifu, I've been able to sort of document some of these more recent performances, and I'm happy to share them with you tonight. This one was a bufu in Kambe, which is where the palace posts in the exhibition actually come from, or reportedly come from. And here we have two Mabuh headdresses, which are actually from two different towns that are interacting with each other. And they do so in a playful but also very serious way where they're almost play fighting. And then in the next one, which is an actual video, and I'll play it in just a second, we have a Mabuh that's performing for a funeral. And it'll give you a little bit more of an action scene to see how dynamic these things move. So that's a typical performance of a Mabuh. Some of the more exceptional ones that Louis Shifu has posted on his channel include them jumping off of cars, doing backflips, and jumping off high poles. That it's quite incredible, some of the acrobatic feats that they accomplish with these costumes and headdresses on. But if you notice in the video that a lot of the people that were interacting with the Mabuh were bent over and in a way genuflecting to it. That's because if you actually confront a Mabuh without something to offer it, a chicken, something to drink, you can actually be injured by it. And so it's a very serious performance and a very important one. And it's wonderful that technology is what it is, and we can actually see sort of a social media presence in Cameroon, able to document these wonderful performances that are happening there. So, as I mentioned, encountering a Mabuh, a headdress, can be very dangerous. Even one exquisitely carved and inactive, as the example on the screen. But when performed by members of kwifon or Noirong, Mabuh demand reverence. It demands to be fed or appeased. The playful appearance of the simian human visage and its toothy grin and cartoonish puffy cheeks would seem misleadingly humorous. Or is it? Anthropologist Nicholas Argenti suggests the audience's real fear of being attacked or injured is serious, but so is the desire to approach, interact, and escape uninjured. It's almost a hazardously alluring and potentially rewarding game that they play. And it's part of the headdress that, the aesthetic of the headdress that brings this to fruition, I think. The fact that it does look playful, that it does sort of invite these ideas of humor. There are many of these examples in museum collections. None of them really resemble the Menil's example, which was frustrating as an art historian, trying to track down something that was comparatively similar and trying to understand the origin of our headdress. The example in the center is probably the closest I came to one that's in a collection in the United States. And the one on the right is similar. You can actually see sort of a parallel between the three masks with the bifurcated nose ridge. On the far left, it's just starting to appear, whereas in the center and the Menil's example, it's definitely present. However, the Menil's example has this amazing coiffure that is deeply symbolic, as well as the neck ring that speaks to the spiders that are used in divination practices. And so it's a little confusing and a little frustrating, and it's not quite clear that something like this is from the same region, or could be from the same region as the Menil's example. However, this example, with the lizards that are around the hair, as well as the more ferocious sort of intense gaze and facial expressions, do suggest a manner of the Mabuh being a dangerous being in performance. However, while looking for a comparative example, I stumbled across Joachim Collas's photograph from 1977. And in this photograph, this is a photograph from Oku of a funerary celebration. And it gives you an idea of sort of the procession of masks or headdresses that are being worn in that region. And if you zoom in on the Mabuh headdress, you see that it's a very similar style and a very similar type of Mabuh headdress, with the deep sockets, the puffy cheeks, the toothy grin, and most importantly, the bifurcated nose ridge. And so it's possible, although speculative, that this may be from the same carver as the mask the Menil's example may be from the same carver as the example you see in Joachim's photograph. But then this really poses a question for the art historical researcher. If this is the traditional stylistic region, and this is where the photograph is from, then why is Kledgeman saying it's from all the way down here? And so these are mysteries that we're still working on, or I'm still working on at the Menil, and hopefully we'll be able to decipher as more research is done on the Mabuh and the works in the permanent collection. I think I'll conclude there with the thought that we're incredibly grateful and privileged to have examples like this at the Menil, and I'd really like to thank my collaborators who have been part of the exhibition, particularly the people in the Cameroonian community, and of course Chifu, who has been so really gracious to respond to me today to finally send me the video. So thank you very much, and I'm open for questions and comments at your leisure.
So if you just raise your hand, I'll bring.
Where is the dancing practice? At the north side of the lake?
So in that, throughout the grassfields, you can actually find Mabuh headdresses throughout the grassfields, but the style if we're going to talk about style, the headdress is particularly in that region that you see on the screen. The dance or the practice of Mabuh, the performance of the Mabuh, happens throughout that region as well.
And the styles of the masks are different. Are they representing maybe different tribes of the area? Or different rivalries maybe of different peoples or people they trade with? It seems like they must have an extensive trading network.
There is an extensive trading network, and throughout the grass fields, you have, as I mentioned, sort of the 150 plus kingdoms that are there. And contest or competition over having the best artwork is a very real thing if you're a king. And so people would commission artists to come to their kingdom and create sort of a royal, or fulfill a royal commission. And so you do see masks of similar style. You see, arguably the horizontal mask or headdress that is worn on top of the head is throughout the grass fields and also through a lot of West Africa. And so there are long histories of interactions between groups, between kingdoms, sharing styles, sharing artists. So it does make it very difficult to say that this headdress is from one particular place, unless you actually collected it yourself and documented that.
I just want to ask about the dancer himself. Does that person have a special place in that society? Is that a full-time job? Is that their mask for life? The feathers and the incredible dancing.
So the person who dances the Mabuh would be the person who is part of kwifon, and they would have a role in kwifon as the person who dances that headdress. Headdresses break and can be replaced. There's nothing that says that one headdress belongs to one. In this case, one headdress belongs to one particular person. It belongs to the society. And in some cases, it actually belongs to the fawn or the king, and is in exchange for the privilege of dancing it at the ceremonies, funerals, enthronement. The other part of your question was, sorry. Okay.
It's not really a question, but a comment. In addition to what you just said, I want to add, Bansoa.
That's where you're from.
Yeah. Bansoa, that is where I'm coming from. That's my village. So I was born and raised over there. And when it comes to Mabuh, Headdress is a long story of art practice that have been in start of migration because people have to interact with each other in that particular region. So we have a story of the mask itself as an object, as a representation, and as well as people that are supposed to use or to wear it. So according to which part of that wide region the mask is found, people are, I want to say, designated people to use it, because this specific one, if we take into consideration the Womb and Con neighborhood where he was mostly used, in that particular area, it was like belonging to a secret society, which means people that are in the organization of the kingdom who are in charge of applying, when the decision of justice is made, they used to wear this type of mask to apply the decision. So, as we can say, the court is making, the judge make the decision, and there are some people to make sure the decision of the court is applied. So, basically, people wearing this mask were the one in charge of applying those decisions. Now, in terms of styles and morphology, you might notice it's like a grimace, like kind of, I mean, I don't know, I'm French speaking, so I'm sorry for my poor English. So the grimace the mask is making is inspired from the monkey, because over there we say the monkey always shows some, like, that was smile or whatever. So the mask itself was inspired by the morphology or the anatomy of a monkey with some kind of exaggeration. You can see it on the eyebrows. So the monkey, the choice of the monkey in that specific region has something to do with the common everyday practice. So they use it to, like, the monkey represents the smartness, at the same time, unpredictable person. I mean, unpredictable animal. So, in terms of styles and representation or morphology, that was inspired from the monkey. Then, they used the mask to apply the decision of the justice, and the variation we might notice from a style to another. I'm putting everything together. I'm sorry, I've not structured my thought. So the variation we can notice from a mask to another, sometimes it comes from the ability of the artist to represent. And sometimes because it has been a circulation, a migration of the object from an area to another, there have been a lot of reproduction. And you did it well to bring out the Fumban art market, where we used to have like a lot of production. And because that area was exposed to people coming from everywhere, so it was a place where they have to reproduce a lot of art based from one original one. So people might get one, and in a artist has assistant. The assistant might be not able to do it as well as they see on the original one. Sure. So in that case, we might notice some variation. So it's not really that it's coming from different areas, but it might be we have an original one, and this one might be the one from which the other reproduction were made, and the variation is related to the capacity or the ability of the artist. They might be young artists, they might be non-experienced artists. So the way they produce it, they are missing some lines because the demand is high. So this is one of the reasons why we might see some changes. And also, being found in Bansoa does not specifically mean it was produced over there,
Right.
because kings have to do exchange of gifts. They send their daughters to get married somewhere, and they send them with some object, and they receive object back. So this type of exchange has been created a lot of confusion when it comes to find where a specific art is coming from. So
Yeah.
that's some of contribution I wanted to make.
Well, thank you, Willie. And I think it really hits home with the idea that, things, the three different ones that I showed, one being attributed to Bamileke, which is not a typical Bamileke headdress. So yeah, I mean, it definitely doesn't need to be produced in Bansoa, but it was found there, reportedly, yeah.
Question about the secret societies and the judgment. So because they're so erratic, like a monkey, do they administer justice? So the person in the tribe who doesn't know the judgment, he administers it in front of the whole tribe. So is he does he perform a public execution even to that extent?
It might be a public execution, but it might be like the secret society is a group of people that share some kind of power or some kind of knowledge, and they have to be undercover because the justice is blind, and we used to say. So whoever the decision is applied to, they consult in their meeting and decide when to apply the decision or when to apply it. So basically, it's a group of people that have the power to do it. Even if the decision is to be applied on the king himself, they will go ahead and do it without having any fee.
If there are any other questions, I'm happy to take them. Otherwise, yeah.
Hi, first, thank you for this incredible presentation. I learned a lot about the headdress, the Mabuh, the Northwest, and Bamileke culture. And I'm from the Bamileke tribe, so I'm learning it here in the Menil, so it's impressive. The question that I had was about the other, I think you had a picture with, I believe it's 5 Mabuh headdresses.
This one here.
Not this one, the one with the colorful, I think you had a good one. The wives. The wives, yes.
Oh, yes.
So I'm curious, do we know where the other 3 are? Oh, it's 4.
There are 4.
Yeah, we
No.
talked about 2, but I'm wondering.
Yeah, no, unfortunately, I haven't been able to track down the other 2. In fact, I don't know who actually acquired the other one that was sold at the auction, at the Christie's auction. So, I mean, we know that this one, for me, it was an important discovery and sort of an ironic one in a way, because the de Menils had actually sponsored the publication of the catalog for the exhibition and would have known this photo and didn't see that the mask was the mask in the photograph, or the headdress was the headdress in the photograph. But so yeah, we don't unfortunately know where the other 2 are, but hopefully through time and through more research we can actually find out where they've been located as well.
Thank you.
It is. Yeah, but I kept it to its original. Yeah.
One question I have on your research. I know we just have a story of how to explain the reason why we could find different masks in different places. But do you have a theory as to where you found, or this headdress was found relative to where it was reported? Do you know do you have a theory about that, or do you know where the research will take you next to find out?
And sorry, I didn't quite hear that.
Yeah, so there is a theory about, I'm curious if you have a theory about where the headdress was found relative to where the picture was first reported, or if that's the next step in your research, what's the next step in the research to find that?
Well, I mean, it speaks volumes to sort of the history of collecting African art, where context and the actual location or provenience of the work is less and less, it's not recorded. And it's not necessarily part of the object's biography when someone acquires it. And so it's a lot of putting together pieces and bits, historic photographs, contextual evidence, other comparative examples to make a case for the fact that it's from this particular region or not. In this case, I was very fortunate. In terms of a theory moving forward with the Mabuh headdress, I mean, working with people like Willie, whose intervention is very much appreciated, and other people who are from the region is really the way to do it. There are still people who are carving these and who are in the tradition of carving, the sons of carvers, and so you can go back and speak to them and speak to their memory, or learn from their memory and trying to address that history. But beyond sort of the information we have, it's really hard to come up with a theoretical approach to dealing with this complicated and layered history. It's really a very sort of practical bootstraps. Go to the region, work with the people, and try and understand where something might be from or who might have carved it. In other regions where scholars of African art are doing that very much so, in Nigeria with Yoruba people, and identifying egungun costumes that date back to the 18th and 19th centuries. We're still, in Cameroon, we're still working towards that ideal, I think.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah. Well, I'll thank you for being here this evening, and stay in touch, and please do come back for Dr. Victoria Massey's talk on the 27th, which it will definitely prove to be a fascinating one. Thank you very much.